You've had a tough life. I read quite a bit about you, and do you have any scars anywhere? Have you been maimed in the years that you've bummed, as they say, bummed around?
This isn't always what makes a life tough.
Behind the tough guy persona of Charles Bronson lies a world of shocking truths, and his daughter finally confirms what we thought all along. Charles Bronson earned a reputation for his portrayal of tough, uncompromising characters, but it also fueled perceptions of him as arrogant and even violent. However, there is one controversial rumor that has been following him from the very start, but the actual truth had long remained hidden. Keep watching as we uncover the real story, confirmed by his own daughter. A rough beginning. Before we take a look at these revelations, we first need to understand what made Charles the man he was. Charles Bronson had a rough start in life, and that had a big impact on who he became later in life. He was born on November 3, 1921, in Scooptown, a part of Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania, which was a coal mining town. His real name was Charles Bukinski, and he was the 11th child out of 15 born to parents who had come from Lithuania. His dad passed away when he was just 10 years old from a lung disease caused by working in the mines for years. Life wasn't easy for Charles and his family. They struggled a lot, barely making ends meet. Charles experienced poverty firsthand. When he was only 6 years old, his family couldn't even afford new clothes for him, so he had to wear a dress to school that had been handed down from one of his older sisters. Can you imagine that? And fast forward to when he was just 16, Charles found himself toiling away in the coal mines, earning $1 for every ton of coal he dug up from the ground. It was grueling work that he always looked back on with bitterness. Those 6 years left him with hands worn from hard labor and scars on his legs and torso that never faded. Spending countless hours in the dark, cramped tunnels took its toll on him, leading to frequent headaches and a fear of tight spaces. "I can still smell the coal in my nose," he would often say, reflecting on those challenging times. Then in 1943, he got called up to serve in the army. But you know how stories can get twisted over time. Well, later on, when he became an actor, people would say he was a tail gunner in World War II. But one clever reporter dug a bit deeper and found out that Mr. Bronson actually trained as a gunner in Arizona and spent his days driving a delivery truck during the war. Once the war was over, Mr. Bronson didn't stick to just one job. Nope, he tried his hand at all sorts of things. He laid bricks, flipped burgers as a short-order cook, and even picked onions in New York. Then, he headed down to Atlantic City, where he rented out beach chairs along the boardwalk. And guess what? Fate stepped in when he crossed paths with some actors vacationing from Philadelphia. He convinced them to let him show off his painting skills for their stage sets. Well, they were mighty impressed and not only hired him, but even gave him a chance to do a bit of acting himself. Now Bronson, who started off painting, discovered something unexpected. He loved acting even more. Back in 1949, he packed his bags and headed to California, where he joined classes at the Pasadena Playhouse to learn the art of acting. There, young Mr. Bronson, just 27 years old, falls for the charms of an 18-year-old aspiring actress named Harriet Tendler. They tied the knot that very year. After some time, he started landing small roles in movies. He played all sorts of characters, tough guys, builders, and even those scrappy fighters you see on screen. But here's the thing. Mr. Bronson didn't quite fit the mold of the typical leading man of his time, like the suave Cary Grant types. Nope, he once joked that his voice sounded so funny, he was more like a quarry than a leading man. In his early days in Hollywood, he didn't get much recognition. You might have seen him in films, but he wasn't getting top billing. He went by the name Charles Bukinski at first. But in 1954, he starred in a film called Drumbeat alongside Alan Ladd, and that's when he officially became Charles Bronson. Why the name change? Well, during those times there was a lot of fear about communism, led by a man named Senator Joseph R. McCarthy. Mr. Bronson thought it might be wise to drop his Russian-sounding last name, considering all the fuss about communism going on, so he became Charles Bronson, a name that would soon be known far and wide in Hollywood. However, he wasn't always in big-budget films. In fact, one of his early works was a movie called Machine Gun Kelly, made on a shoestring budget just 8 days back in 1958. And guess what? A famous French actor named Alain Delon saw it and liked it so much that he invited Mr. Bronson to France. There, he starred in another movie called Adieu l'ami, and it became a huge hit all across Europe. His personal life parallels. Before we take a look at the revelation made by his daughter, let's talk about one of his memorable roles that was closely related to his real life. In 1963, he played Flight Lieutenant Danny Tunnel King Valinsky in a movie called The Great Escape. Danny was an expert at digging tunnels to break free from prisoner of war camps, even though it made him feel claustrophobic. Funny enough, Bronson could relate to Danny because he had his own experiences with claustrophobia. You see, during World War II, Bronson served in the military, and he also worked in mines as a child. Both of these experiences left him feeling uneasy in tight spaces. His difficult marriage life. Despite his tough exterior, filming those tunnel scenes must have been quite challenging for him. Yet he persevered. And guess what else happened during the filming of The Great Escape? Bronson fell head over heels for a lovely actress named Jill Ireland, who was already married to David McCallum. Bronson even joked with McCallum about marrying his wife, but it turned out to be more than just a joke. He ended up marrying Ireland. While all this excitement was happening, Bronson's first marriage to Harriet was falling apart. They eventually divorced in 1965. By the time Bronson tied the knot with Ireland in 1968, people already knew him well. Even though the scripts for his movies weren't always top-notch, most people agreed that Bronson always brought his A-game to the screen. Fans across the globe were crazy about Bronson, especially in Japan, France, and Italy. They even had a nickname for him in Italy, Il Brutto, which means the ugly one. Ireland didn't mind it one bit. She saw something special in Bronson, a mix of tenderness and toughness that drew her to him like a magnet. His name became synonymous with violence. Bronson wasn't just tough on screen. He had a reputation off-screen too. Some people even said his face told stories of rough times and violence. When he was young, he got into scrapes, threatening people and even breaking a sergeant's arm during a brawl. Once, he even got into it with a director over a scene, leaving the poor guy gasping for air. So it's no surprise that when a tough guy like Michael Gordon Peterson, better known as Britain's most notorious prison hardman, needed a new name in 1987, he chose Charles Bronson. That name carried some serious weight. Back in the day when Esquire magazine quoted Bronson saying he'd take down anyone who dared to harm his family, it stirred up quite a fuss. Even Johnny Carson, the famous TV host, couldn't help but ask Bronson about it. Bronson didn't beat around the bush, simply stating, "Because that's what I said." Bronson wasn't exactly best buddies with the press. He found their questions too probing for his liking. And film critics? He didn't have much love for them either. According to him, they didn't even pay to see the movies they criticized. Roger Ebert, a famous critic, once interviewed him and noted something intense in Bronson's eyes, hinting at a capacity for violence. When it came to dealing with people who rubbed him the wrong way, Bronson didn't hold back. He had a run-in with Nicholas Gessner, the director of a film they worked on, and Bronson didn't mince words. He openly criticized Gessner, even joking about giving him a good shake. Ireland, his wife, knew about his fiery temper and laughed about it on a TV show. Violent off-screen incidents. Bronson wasn't shy about his clashes with directors either. He found most of them difficult to work with, citing what he called Hollywood nonsense. His reputation for losing his cool on set was no secret. Directors who crossed paths with Bronson often had amusing tales to share about their encounters with the tough actor. Don Siegel, who directed Telephone, recounted a funny incident involving Lee Remick, who was scared to touch Bronson's face in a scene because she thought he might bite her. In Walter Hill's film Hard Times, Bronson played a gritty fighter during the Great Depression alongside his wife, Ireland. Hill remembered Bronson's impressive physical shape for his age, though his stamina suffered due to his smoking habit. There was some tension over editing Ireland's scenes, but Hill and Bronson eventually reconciled, showcasing Bronson's hot and cold temperament. Sean Penn, who directed Bronson in The Indian Runner, found out firsthand about Bronson's preferences for his character. Bronson was reluctant to have his character die on screen, fearing it might disappoint his Italian fans. Even Billy Crystal had an interesting encounter with Bronson when he sent him the script for City Slickers. Bronson called him up furious because his character died in the script. He reminded Crystal that Charles Bronson doesn't die in movies, referencing his famous Death Wish series. Death Wish controversy. Did you know about the controversy regarding his Death Wish movies? So, there's this director named Michael Winner who thought Charles Bronson was just the right fit for the main character, a guy seeking revenge for his family's tragedy. Bronson had this intense vibe that Winner believed suited the role perfectly. The movie is about a man named Paul Kersey, who's a regular architect until something terrible happens to his family. Then he goes all vigilante, roaming the streets with his trusty gun, looking to settle the score with the bad guys. And get this, one of those guys is played by none other than a young Jeff Goldblum. Now, before Bronson took the part, it was turned down by some big names like Clint Eastwood and even Frank Sinatra. Henry Fonda, too, said no, calling it downright repulsive. But when Bronson got asked, he was all in. Bronson, in his usual tough guy style, supposedly said, "I'd like to do it." And when Winner asked if he meant the movie, Bronson's response was classic. "Nope, I'd like to shoot muggers." Now, you might be thinking, was Bronson okay with the controversial theme of the movie? Well, his agent Paul Kohner sure didn't think so. He warned Bronson about the risks, fearing the movie might send the wrong message about taking justice into your own hands. But Bronson was firm in his belief that the movie's message was all about the dangers of revenge. He believed that an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, you see, and that was his motto. Death Wish hit theaters on July 24, 1974. It cost $3.7 million to make, but it brought in some serious cash, $22 million at the box office. Can you imagine? Now, Death Wish was based on a book from 1972 by a guy named Brian Garfield. He wasn't too thrilled about how they cast Charles Bronson as the main guy, Kersey. Garfield thought, "Oh, once you see Bronson, you just know he's going to start shooting up the place." But get this, Garfield originally wanted the movie to be directed by Sidney Lumet, with Jack Lemmon in the lead role. Can you picture Jack Lemmon as a vigilante? Well, the director, Michael Winner, wasn't too kind about Garfield's book. He said it only sold 3 copies, and those were probably bought by Garfield's mom. Winner was pretty blunt, saying, "Come on, Garfield, did you think you were writing a fairy tale? This is a story about a guy going around killing people. That's a bit harsh." You know, after the first Death Wish movie hit it big, they just couldn't resist making more. Charles Bronson played Kersey not once, not twice, but 5 times. They kept making sequels in 1974, 1982, 1985, 1987, and finally in 1994. But the author of the original book, Brian Garfield, wasn't too happy about it. He thought they were just showing off Bronson's acting skills, which he didn't think was all that great. He even said the sequels were just vanity showcases for Bronson. Now, these movies didn't just fade into the background. They kept stirring up trouble. Remember in 1984, when that guy Bernhard Goetz shot 4 young black men on a New York City train? They called him the subway vigilante. Well, when the director of Death Wish, Michael Winner, was asked about it, he made a pretty cringe-worthy joke. He said, "I don't approve of what Mr. Goetz did, but hey, if he's got to shoot someone on the subway, why not when we're opening?" Not the most sensitive thing to say, right? But wait, it gets even weirder. In 2015, Donald Trump, yes, the former president, started talking about Death Wish at one of his rallies. He was boasting about having a handgun permit and said if anyone attacked him, he'd shoot them. And get this, the crowd started chanting Bronson's name. Trump even said they couldn't make Death Wish today because it's not politically correct. The movie about his life turned out to be disappointing. After all those Death Wish movies, Bronson finally hung up his vigilante hat in 1994. But he didn't retire just yet. He made a bunch of TV movies called A Family of Cops. Now, Bronson's characters were always the strong, silent types, weren't they? Tough guys who let their actions do the talking. And that wasn't just a coincidence. Bronson himself preferred to let his deeds speak louder than his words, especially as he gained more influence in the industry. He wasn't one to chat much, and believe it or not, he couldn't even bear to watch his own films. But here's a twist. Imagine being so famous that they make a movie about your life. In 1990, when his dear wife Jill Ireland passed away after battling cancer, her memoirs were turned into a film. Jill Clayburgh portrayed Ireland, and Lance Henriksen took on the role of Bronson. Now, you'd think most people would be touched by such a tribute, right? Well, not Bronson. He was downright upset about it. He even talked about taking those filmmakers to court. Here, Charles Bronson's on-screen toughness seemed to spill into his real life too. The truth behind his wild stories. He used to tell wild stories about his past, making it sound like he was even violent off-screen. He'd talk about fights and how good he was at throwing knives, but as it turns out, those stories weren't exactly true. Seems like he was just trying to make himself sound more interesting. He never actually ended up behind bars, and people who knew him off-screen said he was nothing like the violent characters he played in the movies. He was just adding a bit of spice to his own legend. Now, people still call him arrogant because of his habits, but there's an even more interesting story behind it. In his lifetime, Bronson had a curious habit. He didn't shake hands with people. Some thought he was just too proud. But the real story is quite different. Bronson was actually scared of getting sick, so he avoided handshakes to steer clear of germs. Some people even think he might have had a bit of OCD, but that's just another assumption. Bronson had another fear that stayed with him all his days: fire. It was a big deal for him. It influenced how he lived, like when he was shooting Death Wish back in '74. Bronson made sure they stayed in hotels with rooms no higher than the second floor. Why? Well, he was dead set on making sure if there was a fire, they could all get out safe and sound. Isn't it funny? Bronson might have played the tough guy in movies, but deep down he had his worries, just like anyone else. In fact, he was more sensitive than many could realize. He loved to paint and sculpt in his spare time. You might not expect it, but he even preferred talking about his paintings over his acting in interviews. And get this, he didn't want people buying his art just because he was famous. So he painted under his real name, Bukinski, to keep his identity a secret. And guess what? His paintings sold well on their own merit. Now let us tell you a heartwarming story about Bronson and a young Kurt Russell. Russell was just 12 when he acted alongside Bronson in a movie. When he found out it was Bronson's birthday, he decided to surprise him with a remote-controlled airplane. But Bronson's reaction wasn't what Russell expected. He seemed a bit distant at first, but then something wonderful happened. A few months later, on Russell's own birthday, Bronson gave him a top-of-the-line skateboard. And when a security guard tried to stop Russell from using it on the studio lot, Bronson wasn't having it. He marched right up to the studio boss with Russell by his side, declaring, "We're both going to be skateboarding around the lot." Now, isn't that a touching example of kindness and friendship? Tragic loss and his resilience. Indeed, he was a man who felt deeply and endured his fair share of hardships, including the tragic loss of his beloved second wife. 8 years after losing her, he found love again with Kim Michelle Weeks, a younger actress. She was there for him until the very end. Bronson had some health troubles, like needing a new hip at one point. Eventually, he decided to retire from acting because of his health. He passed away in 2003 at 81 years old due to problems with his breathing and lung cancer. Charles Bronson actually had multiple children: Zuleika Bronson, Tony Bronson, Suzanne Bronson, and Katrina Holden Bronson. However, now Katrina has confirmed that she was actually adopted and not a biological daughter. Despite this, she has been successful as a film director. But what's even more interesting is how much money he had. Bronson was smart with his contracts, so he ended up being worth a lot. around $75 million in today's money. He had all sorts of properties, from mansions to farms. And you know what's touching? Among all that wealth, the most precious thing he left behind was a painting called Scoop Town, which was owned by Harriet, a memory of his past that he held dear. The story of Charles Bronson is a reminder that no matter how tough a person may have appeared, there's always room for love and humanity. So what legacy do you hope to leave behind, and what treasures will define your journey? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more video updates. Until next time, stay tuned.